First things first, let's open up our kit. Make sure that you get your sewing machine threaded and the new sewing machine needle put in from your kit. And let's grab the rest of our pins as well. You're also going to need scissors, and then let's get our pieces out. So we have one large piece with stripes on it. And then we also have two smaller pieces with stars. The smaller pieces are going to be like the end caps of our table runner. Now, if you want to iron these wrinkles out, you are going to want to use a press cloth because this is outdoor fabric. Now, what is outdoor fabric? Outdoor fabric is fabric that is specially treated to be protected from UV rays. So typically the sun and the UV rays will break down fabric and make the colors fade out, but this stuff is treated so that the UV rays won't harm it as much. Now, this also means that you cannot put it in the washing machine. If you wash outdoor fabric, then it takes that UV coating off. What is a press cloth? So a press cloth is something that you use while you are ironing that goes between what you are trying to iron and the iron. And this makes it so that the iron doesn't melt the fabric that you're trying to flatten out. You can use an actual press cloth that you purchase, or you can just use a piece of cotton fabric to sandwich in between your iron and the item that you're trying to get ironed. Now, first step here, we're going to sew these short pieces on the ends of the stripe piece. Now, make sure your stripes are going into the star section as pictured here, and we're going to line these edges up, pin in place, and sew along those edges. Now remember, we are using a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this project. At our sewing machine, we are going to go ahead and get this going. Now make sure that when you start, you remember to hold the strings on your sewing machine, those tails, that way it doesn't suck into the sewing machine when you get started. Once you're a few stitches in, you can let go of those. And then we're going to make sure that we reverse stitch for about 4 or 5 stitches at the beginning. So stitch forward about 4 stitches, then hold your reverse button and stitch backwards about the same, and then just keep going. Remember to take your pins out as you get to them. And then once we get to the end, we're going to reverse stitch at the end as well. That reverse stitch just acts like tying a knot, and that way nothing will unravel as we work with the piece. Remember to trim all your threads. You can use the trimmer on your sewing machine or a pair of nifty scissors. And here you can see it's starting to come together. This is kind of what it's going to look like as we go along. Looks pretty good. Good job. Okay, so our next side, we're going to do basically the same. A pro tip here, as you're going, if it's kind of bunching up, make sure you're pushing the long tail as you go. Now back at the ironing board, we are going to push the seam allowance from the back, those raw edges, over towards the star piece. And you can kind of push it down a little bit with your fingers. And then we have our press cloth here that we're just going to lay over and use the iron to hold that flat. And once you've gotten a little piece done, you can see a huge difference in how nice it looks from the place that we haven't ironed. So we're going to do that all the way down where the stars and stripes meet. Remember, we're pressing this towards the stars. Now we're going to top stitch along the top here to hold that over. What is top stitching? Top stitching is like the stitching on your jeans, and it's basically just stitching done on the top. But basically what we're going to use it for in this application is to hold the seam allowances on the back over the way that we press them. So back at our sewing machine, we're going to line up the edge of the blue fabric up with the left edge of our presser foot, and then we're going to sew right along that edge. Now that's going to be weird because normally you're used to sewing with the right edge of the presser foot as your guide, but the reason we're not doing that here is because there's so much more fabric that we would have to push through that throat of the sewing machine if we did it that way, and everything would bunch up and it would be a pain. Now once we have pressed and top stitched both sides, we are going to fold this right sides together. See how it looks like it's inside out, and we're going to pin it all the way around. The first pins we're going to put in is matching up these blue seams. Now this is important so that when we are done, it doesn't look all crooked. So we're going to match up these seams and line up the long edges. Then we will pin all the way around all of these raw edges. No need to pin the edge with the fold. Now before we sew, we need to leave a hole right at the edge. That way we can turn it right side out when we're done sewing. The hole should be about hand width, probably like 4 inches. Now we're going to start sewing on the end of that hole. Make sure that you reverse stitch here. That's going to be very important. Instead of stopping your seam and starting a new seam at the corner, just sew to about 1/2 inch away from the edge. Put your machine needle down and then pick up your presser foot. This will let you pivot the fabric around that needle so that you can change direction. Once you are lined up with the new edge, put your presser foot back down and keep sewing. Once that's done, we need to flip this right side out. So just stick your arm in that little hole we left and start turning. It's also important to get all 3 of these corners poked out nice and square. I like to use scissors or a pencil or the corner of a ruler to do this because your finger just isn't quite pointy enough to get a good pointy square corner. Once that's done, we need to iron this flat. So start on the sides that we sewed together, and we're going to pull that seam allowance out so that it's right against the edge and that the top and the bottom are even, kind of like the end of a perfect sandwich. So work around this edge here, pulling the seam allowance out so that everything lays nice and flat. Now we're going to do this all the way around where we sewed, and we are going to leave the folded edge alone for now, and you'll see why in a second. Now once we get over to this edge, we're just going to iron around to the bottom of the hole that we left. Then we need to turn these raw edges in so that they don't stick out anymore. We're going to turn them in about 1/2 inch, and this should make them even since our seam allowance was 1/2 inch. You can adjust this so that the end here looks square, but keep those raw edges folded inside in the top and the bottom edge even. Now once you get that all figured out and it looks even, you can press it with your fingers really quick to hold until you can get it ironed. Now for this spot, we're going to iron it really good because we want it to stay folded until we can get around and top stitch that. Once you get it ironed, it's a good idea to put a couple pins in here as well, just to hold that in place. Now we are going to work with that folded edge that I told you to leave alone. Before we iron that, we need to make sure that we start at the sewn edge and push up towards that folded edge. Now, by doing this, we're just going to make sure that there's no wrinkles on the top or the bottom, and that the top and the bottom half are equal length. This is going to make sure that once we sew it with our top stitching around the whole edge, we don't have any twists or anything weird. Once done with that, we are going to top stitch all the way around the outside of this. That will also help close that hole. Once finished, you have a beautiful table runner. Good job!